guys know that we're actually not going to be doing the pre-assessment. That was just kind of a fluke, but we wanted to. But what I wanted to ask you about was, what did you notice about the way that you felt when you were doing the pre-assessment versus when you had the LED and could work with other people? Anxiety.
I kept wondering if I was in the right session.
Right. So we wanted to use this exercise as a way of really illustrating that there are multiple ways of teaching and learning the same thing, right? So you can either have the pressure of having to know it all yourself and having to bring it all the information yourself, or you can learn it collaboratively. So one style of teaching tends to be in the more formal education setting. The other tends to be found more in the more informal setting. I know a couple of you said you were coming from libraries. Some of you were coming from school districts. So we found that simple circuits that include LEDs, like the thing that you just put together yourself, they're a really great introductory tool to creative technology and to ways of personalizing technology in a creative way. So this is actually called physical computing. You guys took your first step towards physical computing today, which is really exciting and really cool. And just something as simple as an LED and a coin cell battery, it's a really great entry point to combining technology with literacy. And so basically you've made electricity into something that you can hold in your hand. And here's an example of what I say when I mean technology and literacy. So this is from one of our YOUmedia learning labs in Philadelphia. And it's a copper tape circuit. So you just using LEDs, marker, and copper tape, you're able to develop the beginnings of a narrative and the beginnings of a story. So I'm really interested in the question, how can you use technology to tell a story? How can you use things like the beginnings of physical computing in order to tell a story? So I'm the point person for the YOUmedia Learning Labs network. And as a network, we're really rethinking teaching and learning in the informal setting. So through a collaborative, more hands-on approach, where it's not so much about being tested and not about having the burden of bringing all of this knowledge with you to a place. It's about trying to figure out things together and learning and creating together. It's not really about me as the facilitator passing knowledge on to you. It's not that one-way street. It's about us learning and making things. So you can teach me and I can teach you, and we're basically equals in this. So I'm going to talk more about the larger network and some of the principles and ideas behind YOUmedia. And I'm going to be talking more at the macrocosmic level. And then I'm going to pass it over to Jen, and she'll give you more of a view of what this looks like from the day-to-day of a learning lab site here in Houston. Like I said, we're part of this YOUmedia network, and it's a national network, and it's housed in the National Writing Project. So I work out of Berkeley. It is funded by the Institute for Museum and Library Services, that's IMLS, and the MacArthur Foundation. And this initiative grew out of an IMLS MacArthur grant that started in 2011 is about when it started, and it was given to 29 libraries, museums, and community centers across the U.S. And it's a really diverse range of sites. There's the Madison Children's Museum, there's the New York Hall of Science, the San Francisco Public Library, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. They're all over the place. So as you can imagine, these sites look really different when you walk into them, but they all have some unifying principles and some unifying ideas about how youth learn best and how facilitators learn and guide programs best. Another thing that they have in common is that they ask a lot of interesting questions, like, what is the role of a library or museum in the 21st century? And that's some of my favorite questions. All right, so I'd like to step back and look at what many people may think of when they think of a typical traditional learning ecosystem. So in this model, school is the place where you learn and gain knowledge, and through school, you're put on this pathway to learning, whether it's through college or the workplace, I guess, which is pictured here. So typically what you've learned is assessed through tests, and as you can see, it's a very linear path of learning in school to your future, whether that's a job or a college on the way to a job. Now, if you look at this graphic outside of that pathway, there are resources and organizations like community organizations and social media, civic institutions, the internet, that may have opportunities for learning outside of this formal pathway. Just to illustrate this a bit further, say you're a student in a public school in Houston. Maybe you love singing, you're interested in learning how to make music, but your school doesn't really offer any music making classes that might be relevant to you. So where do you go to learn? Where do you go to get these new opportunities? There may be many places outside of this path. The first thing I can think of is going on YouTube, or maybe there are places in your community where you can access recording studios, learn how to make beats to produce music. So for many youth, these connections and pathways are invisible, and their parents may not see these pathways. Their schools might not have the partnerships and collaborations and connections to adequately support these kids' interests, or classes may be cost prohibitive. So really this comes down to an equity and access issue. Students in wealthier communities often have these pathways highlighted for them. The resources and tools are highly available to them, and they know how to leverage these tools to connect them not only from point A to point B, but between point C, D, E. They can navigate this world really well. So how can we work towards making sure that families and youth know about these learning pathways? How can we leverage these opportunities in our communities? Well, the first thing we need to do, and I think everyone can agree on this, is to get rid of that linear pathway of learning where it's only one place where you go in your community to learn. We really need to start thinking about all of the resources within a community and center the learning in the community and the learning opportunities around the youth in the community. Because for that girl in Houston that's interested in music, it's not just her school's responsibility that she be prepared for a job or for college, and it's not only her parents' responsibility that she be prepared. It's really the community's responsibility to make sure that youth are equipped with the skills and the knowledge to pursue their dreams, whether that's college, career, or a lifelong passion for music. So as part of the YOUmedia Learning Labs network, we hope to start raising a lot more questions to start to address this problem. So through thinking about all of these learning opportunities, both embedded in the community and virtual, we need to start thinking of them as a connected system. So what I'm talking about is this learning framework that's called connected learning. And has anyone heard of this before? I know that some people, there was some mention of connected learning in some of the talks. So connected learning was developed and defined by a lot of researchers and institutions, including Mimi Ito from UC Irvine. Does anyone know Mimi Ito's research? So she was one of the pioneers about this. The Center for Internet and the Center for Internet Research, the MacArthur Foundation, IMLS. This is really a different way of thinking about who gets to be an educator and what places are valid places of learning. And by acknowledging that learning can happen anywhere and anytime, it really democratizes the potential of all of these digital networks and online resources and community resources. So connected learning focuses on bringing together three spheres. So it's, the first is that learning should really be interest-driven. So young people learn best when their learning is connected to their passions, their desires, and to their interests. It should have the opportunity for the youth to connect to their peers who share those same interests. And it should have some sort of potential pathway that leads out of it towards academics or career goals. It should help the young person to develop skills over time that are relevant to them and that have payoff in the real world. So now I want to illustrate what this, I want to pass it off to Jen to illustrate what this looks like in Houston at one of the specific sites.
Okay, so I hate standing at podiums because I'm an educator and so I like to move around a lot. So, and feel free to just jump in, throw out ideas, and ask lots of questions. So I'm the object-based learning manager at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. And one of my roles when I came to Houston was to really think about developing new audiences and what's the role of the 21st Century Art Museum. We're a huge encyclopedic collection. I mean, we span continents and, 5,000 years of art history. But what does this mean for the audiences that we see in Houston on a daily basis? But what does it also mean as demographics change, expectations change, the role of technology has some implications when standing in front of an original work of art? What does all this mean to us? So as this project rolled out, we developed a teen leadership group, essentially. And we call it HANG at MFAH, so that's Houston Art New Generation. They're the new generation of artists in Houston, so look out. And we did this in a couple of different ways. We essentially started talking to middle and high school teachers to find out what are the needs and expectations from their point of view for their students. We started talking to parents, and then we started talking to teens really deeply about what do they want to see in a museum, what are they interested in, where are the gaps in terms of what the community is offering for them that we can start to fill, and what does our expertise lend to that conversation? We're really good at developing audiences in museums. We're really good at interacting with people and constructing knowledge through conversation, right? We approach learning in museums from a constructivist pedagogy. It's all about conversation, so that's why this feels really stodgy and weird to me. So feel free to jump into the conversation. But it really is. So how do we start to capitalize on that, knowing the research that's coming from Mimi Ito and sort of drawing some really interesting threads through our collections, through our experiences, and through our audiences. So here's a small look at our Houston Art New Generation crew. So what we've done over the last several years, and this program keeps evolving, which is really nice, is we've set up opportunities for teens to come to the museum and work deeply with a mentor artist. We're in an art museum, so we feel like artists are really important to have as a part of this conversation. They're driving what we do from semester to semester. They are bringing to the table ideas, needs, expectations, sort of big, flashy ideas to sort of really kind of finite, specific projects. And then we're leading them through, how do you accomplish these things? How do you accomplish these things in a museum of 550 people, right? How do we start to generate real interest from their point of view to their peers? And it's kind of, it's a very loose environment. And this is tricky for museums. We say we like really loose and kind of informal programs, but the reality is we sort of follow a pretty rigid path of spend time in the galleries, then do some art making, spend time in the galleries, then do some art making, talk, do art making. This does not follow that model. This follows a model of, we're gonna put you in a space with as many tools and opportunities as possible. We're gonna pair you up with somebody who knows a lot about art and a lot about new media and see what happens. And our new media artist is really pushing them to think about what is the role of technology, so both physical computing, or sort of using physical computing, both analog and digital tools, and what does that mean for the implications of art as a medium, and using technology as a medium of the 21st century. Any questions so far? Comments, ideas? Okay. So here's a look at our giant museum. We did not have teens coming to our museum outside of school programs. So teens were not self-selecting to spend time at our museum. We're in a big city, we're 4.5 million people, we're a huge museum, there's lots of conflicting or opposing possibilities. How do we generate interest in what feels like a very traditional art museum? How do we interest a bunch of teens to come and spend their free time with us? And that's where we really tapped the conversations with our teen group to ask them, what is it that you want to do and what is it that your peers want to do here? So we started asking them, what's the role of the 21st Century Museum? And, they have a lot of ideas. They're very clear about what their expectations are and how they spend their free time. And what they told us is that they wanted access to people with specific types of expertise. Well, we've got a lot of that at the museum, right? And that can be anything from a curator to a conservationist, right, to the prep department who's hanging works of art in our galleries. They really wanted to deeply understand works of art and from their point of view be able to construct knowledge around those works of art. And they also wanted the opportunity to impact a museum like this sort of long term. So we started throwing around all these ideas and, chatting some more and experimenting a lot. And what we started to really think through was, what does it mean to make, right? So this maker movement is kind of picking up steam really rapidly. But for us, what are the connections between making and the Fine Arts Museum, right? Well, our walls are full of evidence of making and creating. Whether it's a 14th century portrait to something, a piece of digital art that was made last year, the threads are there through the productivity of critical thinking. So, we struggled a little bit of how do we get teens really excited about a 14th century portrait. It might not seem that exciting. But what we found was spending time in the galleries and talking about these original works of art really gave them the language and the perseverance and the grit to then go into a space like this and think through, how do I problem solve if I want to make something? So it looks and feels a lot like a makerspace at the museum, which is a really sort of fascinating thing. But what this also mimics in our mind is a 21st century artist studio practice. Questions, comments? Okay. So here they are, spending time in the galleries. So we meet weekly. We've been meeting weekly for 3 years now, and we sort of pick up new teams along the way. And every week that we meet, they have the option of doing essentially whatever they want. Now, this can be a terrifying thing to a lot of people, right? It's like the open-ended conversation. Where is this going to go? And if it's just an open-ended sort of learning environment, that means we have no control, right? And this can be scary to lots of people. But also, sort of, what are the outcomes? What are the learning outcomes? Well, we see this as an arc. I mean, this isn't a start-to-finish program, right? This is something that happens over a long period of time. And so some of the options that they sort of take advantage of is, when do we want to go in the galleries and talk about art? When do we want to make art? When do we just want to sit down and talk about the process of creativity? When do we want to meet with a curator to figure out what does it mean to even be a curator? What are the options of careers in museums? And then sort of, how can we start to connect that with what they're doing in their classrooms? So one of the projects that they said they really wanted to do was have a bigger impact in the museum. They wanted to see more of their peers and friends coming to the museum on a regular basis. So our film curator actually reached out to us and said, look, it could be really interesting to work with Hang and curate a series of films so they can sort of understand the process of selecting films for a public audience, making the introduction to a film, leading a Q&A session afterwards. How do we do this with a bunch of 16-year-olds, right? But she was willing to sort of go out on a limb a little bit and just say, well, let's just try it and see what happens. Of course, they ate up this opportunity. They get to work with a curator, which they're super excited about, right? But also, they were able to sort of talk about their own work within the museum in a really significant way to the public of 280 people as a captive audience in an auditorium. So here's an image. Their first film selection that they chose was called 8-Bit. And so it's a documentary film about new media artists hacking Game Boys to create music. So it aligns very much with what they're tinkering with in their studio practice at the museum, but it also elevates what people see as hacker art to the Fine Arts Museum. And so they were very cognizant of making these choices, which I think, we underestimate teens a lot of the time. So giving them the opportunity and tools to do this elevated that experience for them. So what you're looking at here is so our teens are down here on the right, standing at the podium, talking to the public. And on the screen, they Skyped in the director of the film. So he too is a hacker artist. And they had a really critical conversation with this artist about what it means to hack, right? What it means to create new media art in an encyclopedic collection. I mean, they asked about sort of his career as an artist and how do you sort of pull those threads through your current studies and, how do you start to project that? And the lovely thing is that not only were they having that sort of one-to-one connection with this director as a mentor, but they were then sort of conducting this conversation with their peers. And so they've welcomed in, 280 teams to the museum to have this conversation. And what we're seeing here is that they're taking a lead within the institution. And for us, that's wildly imperative as we start to see them kind of progress through college years and then become lifelong museum goers, but also lifelong learners, right? I mean, this is capitalizing on what they want to do in its purest form and then creating those opportunities for them.
I was just going to say, I have a 12-year-old at home, so I know, but people in here might not know about the whole hacking thing. I think it's got such a bad negative connotation to it, but I mean, kids are just hacking everything, and it's all about like hacking Game Boys or it's more about like getting through life, making life simpler by hacking something. So it's not so much like hacking a computer, but you know what I mean? I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, and it's interesting. One of their questions was, they asked him to talk a little bit about the negative connotations of hacking and sort of how that shift is it is shifting through our lexicon in terms of not being as negative. Right. And, of course, he has kids, and so he was kind of messing with them a little bit. And he said, actually, there's something really interesting about it being hacking. Because there's two sort of ways to think about it. It's kind of this underground movement, which everybody, especially as a teenager, you sort of want to be involved in some sort of underground movement, right? But another way to think about that is taking something that's already working and improving it. I mean, we see hacking at the museum as a second or third or fourth iteration of something. When they come up with ideas and projects, our mentor artist says, okay, well I bet somebody's already done that. Let's find an Instructable online, let's find the forums that are talking about how to do this, and then let's improve upon it, because I already know we can improve upon it. And so how do you already take what's there and either simplify to make your life a little easier, right? Or how do you improve to make it that much better? And really what we're talking about here is problem solving in its finest iteration, right? Thanks for jumping in.
Yeah.
So, not only are we engaging the teens as a new audience, but they offer several open studios a year at the museum. So what they do is they say, look, we've got a couple projects we're ready to highlight and show off to the public. How can we schedule some time to do this? And what you're seeing here are two teams who have built essentially a drawing robot. So they've modeled and printed 3D parts. They've looked up instructions on how to construct this thing. They've written code. And what's happening here is this marker is drawing on this ping pong ball as the ping pong ball is revolving. And so so in these open studios, we're inviting the public to come in and talk directly with the teams about what they're doing, how they're doing it, and why this is important to the museum. The interesting thing is after our last open studio, they said, everybody's just really wowed by the technology. Nobody wants to hear the content behind what we're doing. And so they're starting to rethink how can they show off their projects, but also talk about their artist intent, which, again, for the art museum is hugely important for us, because yes, the technology is a tool, but it's just a tool to sort of think more critically about art.
Yeah, I think they're much more about the process of the creating
Yeah.
as opposed to the end result. Like, it's one thing to see something that's been hacked, but if they came up with and had to think through the whole process, that's like the genius part they love.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, you know, so this is another difference in this program versus other programs you'll see at our museum a lot of times, is that at the end of other programs you walk away with something in hand. These teens rarely take anything home with them because they're often collaborative projects, but they're also way less interested in the end result and much more invested in the process of understanding it. And half the time they cannibalize these projects and turn them into something new, or just dump the parts or hack it to sort of make it into something else.
Yeah, I think this has a lot of really interesting, and we can talk about this more towards the end, but this has so many interesting implications for literacy and different kinds of literacy, and what does literacy look like when it goes beyond just books and writing. Like, because there's definitely some sort of literacy that's happening here, right? There's coding that's going on. These kids are also problem solving. They're coming up with digital learning and literacy strategies. So I think it also raises a lot of interesting questions.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this idea of literacy needs to sort of be pulled beyond this idea of kind of reading, right? I mean, we're talking digital literacy, we're talking visual literacy. We're talking about sort of the ability to connect in a transdisciplinary way, which I think the museum is a really good place to do that. I mean, when we started thinking about working with teens, you know, their course schedule at school is very siloed. You're going to go from math to language arts to science, and then maybe you'll do some art. And you're going to sort of have to switch between brains pretty quickly. But what this does is really allows art to sort of take the center of that, and working through digital literacy to then transcend the appropriate habits of mind and thinking processes that apply across the curriculum. And you know, they're pretty cognizant of this in terms of how this starts to connect to their classroom, but it's never a focus. Oftentimes they'll come back to Hang and say, you know, we were doing I was in my computer science class, and I was 10 steps ahead of everybody because we wrote that code 2 weeks ago for the drawing robot. So there are these kind of nice anecdotal pieces of information about how what we're doing in the museum is supporting their academics, but also what how the academics are supporting what the museum is doing. And again, I mean, this is putting us on a level playing field in terms of the learning ecosystem. So the other thing that we think through, because this is a leadership group for us really, is sort of what are the qualities of good leaders, right? And sort of how do we start to cultivate those? And some of those qualities that we find really important and that the teens have given us a lot of feedback on is working in groups, right? Sort of the soft skills of managing a lot of different ideas, listening really carefully, and then kind of drawing up a plan to proceed through, whether it's a workflow. I mean, we all use this every day in our lives, right? Also, really good communication skills. So how do you communicate with somebody in order to get a project completed? Even things like, okay, so how do we source information? If we want to hack a Game Boy, what are our best sources to get to that information so that we can then iterate on it? So, of course, you know, I'm the object-based learning manager. So my big question is, you know, how does this all relate to an original work of art? Well, so the cool thing about working with YOUmedia and objects is that code is an object. And so it's one of the few objects in the museum that you can actually touch and mess around with. And in fact, we encourage you to do that. So this is an image of one of our photo curators meeting with the teens. They decided that they wanted to do some gallery talks for other teens. And so he's sort of talking with them about the importance of this original object. But when we're talking about YOUmedia, the beauty is that we can look at a piece of code. We can grab code from YOUmedia artists online and start to understand through our digital literacy, sort of what are the elements there, and how then can I iterate on that again? And in fact, new media artists expect you to iterate on their work. Most of them will post their work online so that you can access the code or the work of art and iterate. So again, we're really, really developing some complex critical thinking skills here. This is another form of a drawing robot. Again, they've 3D printed these sort of green components, and our mentor is sort of guiding them through, like, what are we troubleshooting here? This thing isn't exactly hanging on the wall correctly. It's not producing the image where, you know, we've written into the code. So what do we need to do here? So all of this is really peer-based learning. While it's guided by our mentor, he's asking the tough questions, right? He's pushing them to think a little more critically about things. But it's really about our teams working together to solve these problems.
Jen, can you talk a little bit about the documentation process that kids engage in?
Yeah, so a couple different things. So primarily what our group has been doing is building out a website that highlights all of their projects. In fact, Andrew here in the black t-shirt, so he goes to a school for performing and visual arts, but he's a creative writer. And so he took the lead on developing this website, and he's blogging every week about what's happening in our space. And then we've got several other teams who are taking pictures and creating videos to then document the work for themselves.
What is the website?
It's not live yet.
Oh, okay.
But my card's up here, and I'm happy to share it. He's a little nervous about pushing it out there.
Sure.
He wants a lot of content on there before it sort of goes live. But again, this was all, it was their idea. They said, look, we're creating all these really cool projects. We want to share this with our peers. We want to be able to even use it as a portfolio as we're looking to school, right? Because these are all about 16-year-olds for the most part. And so how can we start to document that from our own point of view, which I think has more meaning, not only for them, but also for us, because we know we can, you know, write some museum-y jargon about learning and outcomes and how great this is, but from their point of view, really documenting the impact is particularly of interest to us. And then of course, I mean, they've got really cool stuff on there. So I'm happy to send the link out. So I've touched on this a little bit, but you know, in spaces like this, the mentor is a huge component. And as K-Fi said, the mentor is not only a facilitator of sort of helping you understand these things, but they're sort of the crux of how all of this comes together. And we've messed around thinking through what qualities does a mentor need to have, what are the skill sets that a mentor needs to have, and our mentor is a new media artist. Our hang space looks a lot like his studio space. His work involves sort of DIY culture and elevating DIY work into a fine art space. And so he was kind of the perfect fit for us. But it's interesting because they really value that sort of quality in him, his expertise, but they also really just like him as a person, right? Like he's gonna eat that, like 3 bags of Doritos with them, right? And sort of enjoy the ridiculousness of music and whatever else, pop culture, but he also can really push them to think long and hard about their work, their role at the museum, what the expectations of are from museums, and sort of how can he elevate them in a really significant way. Yeah.
How many hours do these teens spend?
We have, our programs are about 2 hours each week. And I will tell you, so we've got teens who drive 45 miles one direction to spend time with us every week. Yeah,
and what day do you guys meet?
Friday nights. We've dabbled in all sorts of hours. Friday nights are the only nights we can get most everybody there all the time because they can take a break from homework.
Right.
We've had teens last summer, so we extend our summer hours quite a bit because they're out of school. Last summer, the Warped Tour was here in town. We had 2 teams at the concert, but they took a 2-hour break to come back to hang for a few hours and then went back to the concert, which I think is a real indication of success for us if they are leaving something like a really awesome music concert to come hang at Hang. So the other nice thing about our mentor, because he has a fine arts background, he can really help them internalize what the role of technology is in a 21st century museum. Again, this is his practice, but he has a fine arts background, so he can talk about those 14th century portraits as well as anybody at the museum can, and he can help them understand, how is this connected to a drawing robot? Or is it?
So it's a grant, it's a grant, right?
So the program started with a grant with funds from IMLS and special funds from the MacArthur Foundation.
Okay.
That grant finished, what, 2 years ago?
Well, for
Yeah.
2 years, but last year.
Okay, so, but you've continued the program?
Yeah, a big part of our grant was looking at sustainability for the museum. It did not make any sense to do all this work and then to see the program go away. So we built a sustainability plan, which means we have budget money in our annual operating budget to run the program, and we have a wildly active development department who raises more money for us all the time.
So you're folding in new kids all the time?
All the
Is that how
time.
it works?
It's complicated, yeah, especially because some of these kids have been with us for 3 years now, and so their level of expertise is about 10 steps ahead of other kids. But what we do is we use them as junior mentors. When we sort of do an open call for more teams, we really let them start to show the new teams basic skills. So they'll run a soldering workshop for us. They'll take them through the galleries and give them the lay of the land. And so we're starting to level them up into thinking themselves as junior mentors.
So you end up getting kids from every socioeconomic level as far as like, you know, bottom to the top?
Yeah, and in fact, we probably see more of that kind of lower end.
Really?
So the museum has a K through 12 art school attached to it, where it's all fee-based, and we're talking, you know, several $100s to take a week-long course, right? This is free, and so we're building some capacity, but we're also offering something that we hadn't been offering before to that sort of lower socioeconomic end of the community. And again, I mean, this starts to level the playing field pretty rapidly for us. I mean, in some ways, and that's just because I'm running the program, this has more of an impact over a long period of time than a week-long course that you're going to drop several $100s on, right? Because they can come back and be supported. So we're on spring break here in Houston right now, and 2 of our teams just popped by my office yesterday because they were in the museum looking at art and they wanted to say hello, which is great. I mean, they're spending their off time beyond Hang at the institution, and they've made really great connections with us. I mean, they see us as their friends, which is really nice, which is an important role, I think, for the mentors, is sort of beyond what your teacher says, right? I mean, you're 15, 16, you don't really care that much what your teacher says, even if they're really good teachers. And beyond what your parents say. We have a teen who is the daughter of somebody at the museum. She did not come for an entire year, even though he was like, you should go to this Hang program, you should go to this Hang program. As soon as one of her friends said, I'm going to Hang, she started showing up. So I think the role of that important adult in your life at that point can be really significant when sort of thinking across their kind of learning ecosystem, right? Especially somebody who's, you know, sort of got some skills, kind of has the know-how, but is a really positive influence for them. I think that's it for me.
Does anybody have any questions? We have about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
I wanted to put up a slide with our with our contact information. If you want the answers to the quiz, they're at the bottom. And we also developed a resource spreadsheet of low-cost resources. So if you want to know where to source those LEDs from, or the coin cell batteries, or low-cost or free browser-based software that we use, that's also in that low-cost resources list.
Stay tuned.
How many kids did you say you had in the program?
So we have 50 kids on our roster. Yeah, and you know, we see anywhere between 12 to like 20 at a time. We like to keep our roster at about 50 because of school schedules. Yeah.
And a lot of the sites too, we talk about like, well, do we want to have it be a drop-in program?
Yeah.
But I think we're kind of trying to change the language around it, so it's not so much about being drop-in, because that can be problematic for museums. But we like to say that it's like a low barrier to entry. So anyone can participate at any given time, and you can choose your level of engagement. Great. Well, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for
if you have any
coming.
questions, we have business cards if you want our information, but that's our
Sorry, I
that's
asked.
way to be. Oh, no, please, go ahead, yeah. Do you have a question?
No, I so many.
And you can keep your
Enjoy the
LEDs.
conference.
Yeah.